Hello? Does this work? Yeah. Where did I cut out exactly? I think what happened is that the back connector to to my microphone disconnected. Right. Can you hear me now? You should be able to hear me now. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Ah. Okay, so it's finally coming through on the other end. There's like a 30-second delay. So you never heard us. You never heard me. You never heard anything that I said. Really? So I've just been talking to myself for the last 5 minutes. I was even answering questions as well. Anyway, yeah, that's a boomer tech moment. I apologize. Yeah, I'll tell you what happened. Right, there is the connector at the back, right, to my microphone, and it was like half an inch out. So okay, I'll begin from the beginning, right? So that explains why the number of viewers dropped. So today we're going to be discussing a rather spicy title, obviously. If I'm repeating myself for real. Have I... Oh no, I literally was silent. Yeah, okay. Okay, so the title. Lord have mercy on me. Why atheism is inherently illogical, emotional and illogical. Right? And I said this deliberately to be provocative. I figured I could get a lot of people on the stream, and, well, it would seem that I have. In fact, actually, I asked people to share this in atheist circles so I could get more of their attention. Not because, well, I mean, atheism I do think is irrational. I do think it's illogical, and I say this as somebody who was an atheist myself, right? But it's more because I want to address their actual contention, because it's not really the logical arguments. Most of the atheists that I have seen don't actually understand the arguments, and never have. They will, like, for example, TJ, the amazing atheist, right? He refutes the first way of Aquinas by saying, well, why isn't the unmoved mover a blueberry muffin? And of course, this is because a blueberry muffin is composed and God is simple, meaning that there are parts to the muffin, you know, the blueberries, the flour, etc. Whereas God is indivisible, in the same way that our personalities are. So our anger isn't distinct from our jealousy, isn't distinct from our happiness. We are still the same person, regardless of that. While I can point to the chemical that might make me feel angry, the thing that makes me consent to anger ultimately is my will, which doesn't have a physical organ we can point to. In fact, this is one of the arguments for the immateriality of the soul. But because of this, and because, frankly, one good video actually was by Bishop Barron the other week, right, where he was talking about how it's very strange that the universe is inherently intelligible, and yet there's apparently no intelligent force behind it. And, you know, no one considers this to be, like, somehow contradictory. You'd think that if we could apply mathematics to, for example, natural sciences, right? I mean, I'm involved in what is known as advanced computer science, which is more mathematical than it is naturally scientific. But the place where I'm working in, the field I'm researching, which is artificial intelligence, is all statistical modeling. So this, which is generally used for automation and for scientific testing. Right, so it seems rather strange that we can map mathematics on top of the science itself. But as I say, I don't think this is the real concern that atheists actually have, particularly with Christianity. They actually have more of a problem with the Bible and the supposed immorality of it, and the, on the face of it, immoral actions of people in the Bible. And it actually, you see, in the beginning, originally, with the Bible, before printing presses and things like that came about, only intelligent, educated scholars really had long-term access to it. You'd have, the scrolls read out in synagogues, and you would have the books read out in churches, right? But, you wouldn't have many people, the plurality of people having access to the Bible until relatively recently. And this was largely caused by the Protestant Reformation, which led to a lot... some of the Protestant groups are more sane, but some of them end up having really weird interpretations, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you. And obviously this creates a lot of confusion, because you've got a lot of people who don't know the tradition, don't know what Christ actually is, and don't know why the Old Testament is even there, just making things up as they go along, right? So, like, for example, in Exodus, right, Jethro goes to Moses and solves this problem by creating the Sanhedrin. We had a similar thing in the beginning when Christ, of course, ascended into heaven and the church was formed on Pentecost. With the church itself, the church became the interpretative body of the new law, as Jethro's advice led to the interpretation of the old law. Interestingly enough, the law is actually separate from the judging body in the Torah, which are the first 5 books, right? So a lot of what Christ is doing in the Gospels is saying the Sanhedrin doesn't have authority to do so. Obviously, they possess the seat of Moses, so they should, but a lot of it is like, well, are you really well to judge, say, the woman caught in adultery, for example? But this is exactly the problem. You have a lot of people, including Christians, who will misinterpret the scriptures. So we're going to go and talk about them today, and we're going to start... I've got a list here, actually. This is why I asked even, on 2 or 3 days ago for a list of things. What we should actually address here, because there's a lot of very, very, I suppose I call them very boomer problems that atheists have with the scriptures, like, for example, the fact that there are curses in Deuteronomy 28, and this is bad. It's like, well, yeah, they're curses, that's the point. There's a lot of things like that, where atheists will, and indeed fundamentalist Christians and low church Protestants and stuff, will just take verses completely out of their context in the scriptures and then come to massive conclusions about it. It's like, yes, when in Deuteronomy 28, I think it describes one of the violations of the old covenant being, eating, you being forced to eat your own baby because you're so bereft of food, right? Like, yeah, of course, that's a curse. That's the point. So, yeah, I thought I'd address some of the big ones, right? In fact, one of the things I said before I was recorded was that I think it's very strange how the atheists will often attack the Old Testament, but they will always direct this at Christians and never at Jews. Because a lot of these laws, the Jews, at least still in theory, follow. In fact, I was thinking of doing a stream responding to Jewish polemics against Christianity and also asking the Jews some questions, because on the face of it, it would appear that the prophets themselves kind of debunk modern Judaism in a very, very obvious way. But we'll stick to this. Let's start with a relatively common one. That's the sacrifice of Isaac. So for those who don't know, this is somewhere in Genesis, right? I want to say it's in the 20s, somewhere in the 20s of chapters, right? So Abraham is commanded by God to sacrifice Isaac to him, and he takes him up to the mountain. Interestingly enough, makes Isaac bear the wood that he is to be burnt on, well, to be killed and burnt on as a burnt offering to the Lord. And he stopped at the last moment. They find a ram, and they sacrifice that instead. Now, in a Jewish context, so far as I know, there isn't really a good thing explaining this, right? It seems just like God is commanding Abraham to murder his own son for seemingly no reason, and therefore God bad. But actually, when you consider this through the light of Christ, it becomes very beautiful. Because it's actually showing God the Father's level of respect, or God generally's respect for Christ. Well, for Abraham. Because Abraham, the father of the faith, be it for Islam, be it for Judaism, be it for Christianity, he asks him to sacrifice his only begotten son for the sake of his faith. Now, who else does that? Now, we know that God is unfailing, so it follows that God would send his only son to be brought up to a mountain and nailed upon a tree and sacrificed to God. And guess what? That's exactly what happens with Jesus. And, you know, Abraham, in fact, as Argent says in the chat, the ram, in fact, before Abraham tries to murder Isaac, he actually says God will provide a ram, which is a prophecy. So there's going to be a ram. Now, it seems very interesting that God would, give our Father in faith such a sign. And in that light, it becomes very beautiful, because it really does show the level of respect that God has for Abraham. And that's the first one. Now, how can this work? You see, the atheist... Actually, that's one of the interesting things about biblical criticism. The atheist biblical critics, including people like Bart Ehrman, although Bart Ehrman is more New Testament, actually can't deal with the Old Testament prophecies in a way that makes them not prophecies. It's very funny. There's a book, actually, I should probably get this out, because I'm going to need to rely on it a bit later on. It is called, and I'm going to make it hit the table just to give you an idea of how big it is. Right? It is a Catholic introduction to the Old Testament by Doctors John Bergsma and Brant Petrie. And this goes through all of the books of the Catholic Old Testament and gives you details on them. Sometimes it's not a commentary, it's more of just a straight introduction for Catholics, right? There's no particular focus of it beyond, aside from making it very clear that actually Protestantism doesn't make much sense. And to some extent that Judaism doesn't make much sense. It's just a great resource of works on all of the books of the Bible. Yeah. Yeah, you see George Washington, don't worry about it, right? That was the symbol in that. And I think the second thing we will respond to are the commandments on sexuality. So let's take this as a whole, because there are a number of ones that they will take issue with, right? So, for example, homosexuality, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 18 through 19. The case, apparently women can be raped under the old law and then are forced to remain with the rapist in Deuteronomy 22, verse 29 through verse 23 through 29. Also, the repeated punishment for idolatry in the form of Israel becoming the prostitute, right? The continual, very, very hefty enforcements on sexuality in comparison with what we would call modern, can we even call it morality? There's no real aim for the morality of the modern world. It's just what makes me feel good. So the modern, what makes me feel good? So the reason why the commands of the Torah and of the New Testament, in fact, the New Testament is more extreme in this regard. The reason why there is such a strong emphasis on sexual continence and against sodomy and keeping things married together is because we'll get onto the rape thing later on. Is because if you don't have that, your entire civilization collapses, as we're currently seeing right now. For example, it is seemingly a civil virtue to be of some alternative sexuality, when in fact the data itself, and I will place this in, actually I opened the wrong tab there, whereas in the description, we'll actually find there's actually studies that show that alternative sexualities generally correlate with lower life expectancies, as we see here, as I've posted. And some of these are in relation to, well, one of the studies there is in relation to gay marriages, unquote, versus, just ephemeral behaviour. But it's made very clear that the life expectancy is lower. We can see this in, practicing sexual minorities, we'll call them. We see this even more pronounced in porn stars. And we see a reduction in happiness for those people who are eventually married after having multiple sexual partners. That is why there is such a strong emphasis on sexual continency in the scriptures. And that includes burping the worm, I suppose I'll call it. Because it's a funny metaphor, right? There's a reason why... What's his name? It's completely fled my mind. One of the characters in the Old Testament is struck dead for spilling his seed on the floor. Right? Because sexual continency is the defining thing in keeping a society stable, and God knows this. This is why it's in the Old Testament very strongly, and Christ actually doubles down on that and says, you have heard it said that, you shall not commit adultery, but I say even he who looks upon a woman with thoughts of adultery is doing the same, is already lied with her, right? This is why there's the insistence on the two becoming one flesh in the Gospels as well. Therefore, you should be sexually continent, and the fact that I think that the majority of atheists are often, at least very often, sorry, I'm really falling over my words this evening. A lot of the atheists are kind of bound into their atheism by this sexual incontinency. And I think that making it clear that, actually being a virgin is a good thing, making it clear that having multiple girlfriends is a sign of dysfunction, sleeping with 750 women or however many, that's actually a social disability. Having multiple children by multiple women is a deadbeat thing to do. Murdering your own child is a horrible thing to do, as the Bible also insists upon, and actually links explicitly to fornication. These things are bad. They destroy societies. And if the atheist wants to claim to be scientific, then, he has to acknowledge these commandments. Now, of course, he'll say, oh, this is the modern age or whatever. Right? Then go and read Sex and Culture by J.D. Unwin. He provides 86 cases where societies have collapsed because of the destruction of their sexual continence. Yeah, Onan, that's the one. My mistake. So, you have all these atheists going on about sexual immorality. It's just not practical. It doesn't work. Let's continue with let's read out what is supposedly the rape verses, which I don't actually. Well, when I first read it, I didn't actually see it. It's Deuteronomy chapter 3, no, chapter 23, 22 even, verses 23 through 29. So, let's go. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, which of course implies, consent. And the man, because he violated his neighbour's wife. You shall purge the evil from the midst of you. So they're punishing adultery. I mean, as we've already established, if you do not have stable families, if people are continually cheating on each other, then you are not going to have a stable society. Of course, I'm arguing in a utilitarian way, because the atheist doesn't really think in any other way. You can't give them natural law. Let's continue. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But to the young woman you shall do nothing. In the young woman there is no offence punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbour, because he came upon her in the open country. And though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. So, that's rape. Rape gets the death penalty according to the old law. Granted, it's very important to realise, and this is something that is perhaps underplayed, that these laws got developments as time went on, right? They weren't just blunt, bish bash bosh, this is how we're going to practice it. There are numerous instances of laws, like the laws of the Sabbath, being loosened in extreme situations. For example, the Maccabean War of the 2nd century BC. And finally, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not put her away all his days. So again, this could be fornication. This seems to be fornication yet again. And besides, this is very ambiguous. Right? Now, if it were rape, I figure it would probably fall under the previous law right here, right? Because what you have to remember is that these weren't just arbitrarily doled out, and these laws to just anybody. They were educated people who knew the context of the situation and knew the rest of the law code. So I think that any ambiguities here would be resolved by the person actually enforcing the law. So, let's continue. Another one is the Book of Judges. Actually, I'll make this clear first. Even if this were applied to a woman who was not betrothed and was yet raped, this wouldn't even apply to Christianity anyway, because although Christ has, superseded and because Christ has completely superseded and fulfilled the old law, so this isn't actually, in force. Maybe take it up with a rabbi? I'm sure a rabbi could give you a better answer, because he knows how the old law is currently being enforced right now, but of course I don't see many atheists doing that. Okay, another one. There is this horrifically bloody civil war with the Benjaminites in Judges chapter 19 through 20. And this is started by the Benjaminites, yes, I pronounced it right that time, seizing the wife of a Levite and essentially raping her to death. And this leads to an almost genocidal war that almost wipes out the Benjaminites. Now, the atheist makes the mistake of assuming that this is some sort of moral command, because it's not. It's history. The Bible is largely history. This would be like, for example, reading 2 Samuel and deciding that Daniel's seizing of Bathsheba and murder of her husband Uriah, that this was a moral command, but it's not. So this is a lot of the things here. Like, you will see the Bible pass over a lot of very morally wrong things without actually making any commentary, because the idea is to make you think maybe there were problems in this time. In fact, the Book of Judges and the Book of Ruth actually lead to the monarchical period in Israelite history, where you have Saul, and then Daniel, and then Solomon, and then you have Rehoboam and Jeroboam, etc. The point of the Book of Judges is to show that when people are being relativistic, that people will do reprehensible things. And in fact, this is actually more applicable to atheist and secular morality than it is to the morality of the Old Covenant, because people weren't following the Old Covenant. That's the whole point of the book. The whole point of Judges is that people weren't following the old law in an organized way. They were often syncretizing with the local Canaanite religions, and that occasionally a judge would come along and restore peace in the name of the Old Covenant. That is the point of the book. So, of course, we should expect horrific things to happen, because there wasn't an organized process by which to live. Okay, let's continue. God striking down the man who picked up sticks on the Sabbath, which is in Numbers 15, chapter 32 through 36. Let's find this. While the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody, because it had not been made plain that what should be done to him. And the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, as the Lord commanded Moses. Well, you see, something that immediately strikes me is that a similar thing happens to Ananias and his wife in the Book of Acts, where they don't bring all of their possessions to be sold and join the church and so die. Right? A lot of people just simply drop dead because they have violated a grave command, right? They have committed a grave sin. That's the whole point of a grave sin. And God, seeing this, proves a point. Now, it seems very interesting that he would make the congregation do it. I think this is because... I have no idea why this is, but this is my suspicion. In my suspicion, it is because it's obviously in the Ten Commandments, but there's a natural law precept. This person has violated the natural law, which requires a day of rest a week, and so they're disposing of them. And also to prove... make the people of Israel understand how serious this covenant actually is. Right? And they'll say, oh, well, God just doesn't have any right to do this. It's like, well, yeah, of course he does. He created us. Are we entirely shocked that God, who created us, can also take us away as well? Is this like a serious moral quandary that, like, if you violate the law of your creator, you get disposed of? What do you do with a pencil that breaks? Now, of course, it seems like something relatively mild to us now. But you have to remember back then, it was incredibly important for the old law to be followed. Because you've had the Israelites in Egypt for 400 years, and they don't understand the natural law, because the idolatry of Egypt has warped them so badly. This is why it would seem as if the Ten Commandments are such common sense, because Egypt warped the Israelites so bad that they needed to be reminded of basic moral precepts. And with people who are accustomed to that kind of dullness, you have to remind them in a certain way. And it's often a very brutal way. It also makes clear for us Christians who, while still, it's still part of our history, but it's been fulfilled by Christ. It also makes us clear how seriously we should take our respect for Sundays. Now, of course, later on, as you will see in the scriptures, it seems very strange that they would quote this particular part of Numbers and not acknowledge the later application of this in, for example, First Maccabees. I recall in First Samuel, Daniel also doing similar stuff on the Sabbath, working. Maybe not working, but keeping himself alive on the Sabbath. It seems very interesting that the atheists won't acknowledge this, but it is as it is. By the waters of Babylon. This is one I actually didn't think of. And this is Psalm 136. It's a very famous one. And, in fact, it's 137 in my RSV. So it's 136, I think, in the Douai. It's 137 in, generic I won't say quasi-Protestant, I'll just say Christian Bibles. Right? And it says something quite blunt. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against a rock. Right? And this sort of language is used throughout the Old Testament, where the little ones of Egypt, as in the children of Babylon and the children of Egypt, and it probably relates to Assyria, I'm not sure, are dashed against rocks. Right? So, this would seem on its face, the Bible is advocating for child murder. But this isn't really the case, because you have to understand something called biblical typology, which is something that we've talked about earlier on with the sacrifice of Isaac. We have to understand what Egypt and Assyria and Babylon mean in their time, right? Now, for any people, and I say this specifically to Protestants, and this seems to be something that runs a lot through Jewish interpretations of the scripture, you can interpret these countries as types. Because Moses himself, when he's instituting the Passover and instituting the basic laws in Exodus, reminds the Israelites to, tell their children, this is a reminder for when we were brought out of Egypt. Or it may have even been our fathers were brought out of Egypt. I'm not sure of the particular wording. But for a lot of these Jews, they've never been brought out of Egypt. And likewise, a lot of the time they are used as types, right? They aren't immediately applicable to the current situation. Often they are, right? Like, for example, in Jeremiah 42, Jeremiah is told not to go down to Egypt, and Israel does goes there anywhere in Jeremiah 43, bringing him with him, right? Sometimes these are applicable in that way, but often they're not. They're often spiritual types. So, with dashing the children of Babylon against the wall, or indeed dashing the children of Egypt against the wall, right? These aren't things that Israel itself necessarily did, right? We know in Exodus that they didn't do this. We also know that it was the Persians that ultimately defeated the Babylonians. So what could this mean? It means the types, the idolatry, the licentiousness, the sin of these particular great powers, which are typified, right? So when we are said to dash the infants of Babylon against a wall, we are said to dash the sins of idolatry and of fornication and of, any particular offence against God's law against the wall and the results therein. We are cutting ourselves off from sin. That is what, whenever you read something like that, it really should be that, unless you take some of the weird rabbinical interpretations where it's literally like massacring everyone who's a idolater. Okay. Actually, I'm going to read the chat for a bit. Yeah, I've got to admit, guys, I didn't really prepare as much as I should for this stream, because I spent like 4 days researching all the differences between Judaism and Christianity. Essentially, Judaism doesn't really work and hasn't really worked since 70 AD according to their own prophets. Isidore asks, could the modern Sanhedrin in a narrow sense be the academic theology community with PhDs of Georgetown and Villanova, etc.? No. No, it couldn't. It would be more accurately like an ecumenical council or an ecclesiastical court. Yeah, the Ram is a predecessor of Jesus, Argent. I'm reading like quite far up, by the way, so if I'm not seeing your comments immediately. Not to be antagonistic, but don't pagans sacrifice for their faith? Yeah, but so do the Old Testament Jews. And so do we. We have the sacrifice of the Mass. It's just that Jesus fulfilled that in the single nailing to the cross, right? And because I suspect this is because of the fact that he's in the divine essence. It's continually repeated forever because whatever God does, it is for good. Do biblical slavery? Depends what we mean by slavery, because biblical slavery isn't chattel slavery, which is what atheists will try and liken the Bible unto. It's like chain gangs, basically, if my memory serves. A lot of it is like labour from POWs, and it is labour from, criminals, and it may be debt slaves as well. I can't remember exactly. You see, a lot of these contentions that atheists have with the Bible come from the old law that isn't followed in the same way now as it was, before Christ. Let's see. Lots of people saying bold statements. Let's see here. Okay, vegan world order is being edgy. You are now hidden. Lots of... Is there any edgy comments, really? Not really. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, now would be the time to talk. Oh, thoughts on the McCarrick report. Yeah, McCarrick was a psycho. Well, is a psycho. Just reading that report, I think he had a lot of people quite afraid, and that's why he didn't get done in quicker. Man, where's this guy that you're having like a massive go at? Well, yeah, I mean, George Washington, like, he says here, for the benefit of the audience, I remember reading the story of the rich man who went to hell begging Lazarus to tell his family, but Lazarus said that they won't listen to the prophets, they won't listen to me. Well, yeah, because he would only be repeating what the prophets said. Yeah, vegans are banned. I have actually read Bronze Age Mindset at least twice, and I thought it wasn't particularly good. Could any based man truly say that he wouldn't want to live in a patriarchal society? Well, it depends if the patriarchs are any good. If they're not, what's the point? Okay, let's continue. One common thing I've noticed is Noah's Ark. I've seen a lot of atheists comment on that. Is a huge flood needed to drown and kill all people when God could simply kill them in an instant? Well, it's actually because it's another type. It prefigures two particular events. The obvious one being baptism, but the more important one is, well, maybe not the more important one for us, but the more important one for evangelizing to Jews and to people of the Old Covenant is Naaman the Syrian being told to dunk himself in the River Jordan 7 times in 2 Kings chapter 5 to cure his skin disease. I think it was leprosy. Right? Interesting thing is that that Naaman the Syrian is never asked to go under the old law when he does this, and he just returns to Assyria and serves in the temple of the god of his king. What advice would you have for someone who has trouble discerning between Orthodoxy and Catholicism? Well, aside from telling you to pick Roman Catholicism, what I would do is go and read the Fathers for yourself. So go and read the ones where there are theological contentions. Like, for example, go and read on the Holy Spirit by Saint Basil the Great. Greek Father, Cappadocian. And go and read the theological contentions running up to the final split with Rome, technically in 1054, but really finally it was done by the Ottoman Sultan at the beginning of the 460s. Seriously, just go and read the history, and I guarantee you will find Catholicism to make more sense than Orthodoxy. Okay. Actually, this is a good question from George Washington. It's absurd to say... This is actually one of the questions that I think he sent me, actually. It's absurd to say that God loves you when you can spend forever in hell and God can't rescue you. Well, you see, God actually sustains you in hell, right? You choose hell because you choose inferior goods to God, right? So God, being the creator of all things, is the greatest thing in existence, right? He contains all of the particular aspects of all being, right? And if in this life you decide to pick something that passes away, something that is inferior to that being, say sex or money, right? You're picking something that won't satisfy you in every possible way. And so hell is the natural result of that. You're deliberately picking to avoid being. You're deliberately not loving the Lord your God, right? And instead loving inferior things, which is also a form of idolatry, right? If you go to hell, it is entirely your fault. Now, why is it that God makes us suffer in hell? Right? Well, aside from the vindication of the just, right? Well, you've picked an inferior good, right? And that inferior good will not satisfy you forever. And so you are going to ultimately be not satisfied at all. So you picked an inferior good, you're choosing something that's ultimately sustained by God as well, so it makes sense you'll go to hell. You'll deserve it too. What do you think about nature worship being a gateway to paganism? Well, I mean, paganism is basically nature worship. If you mean, like, actually venerating them as God, right? If you mean, like, I don't know, the Canticle of the Sun by St. Francis of Assisi, then that's fine. Even in the Canticle of Daniel, in the Book of Daniel, he's telling nature to glorify his creator, right? Which is, asserting a certain intellectual capability to them, I suppose. There's nothing wrong with praising and looking after nature. It's just taking it too far. Right? I was talking about the Ark, wasn't I? Yeah. I've already talked. Actually, I've talked about that. Never mind. Why were Rebecca, Jacob, and Laban not punished for their deception? Now, I think he probably meant Jacob and Esau, right? But I'm going to respond to this because this is what he asked, right? Laban is punished for his deception of Jacob, right? So, for those who don't know, Jacob moves to meet Laban, Rebecca, and to meet Leah. And they are living in Mesopotamia. And he works for Laban. Laban is the father of Rebecca and Leah. And Jacob really wants to marry Rebecca. But on his wedding night to Rebecca, he actually wakes up having had it, gone into Leah. And so she becomes his wife. And Laban goes, well, actually, it's our custom that you marry the firstborn daughter first. Right? And so he works another 7 years and then marries Rebecca. Right? Which is seemingly a deception. Now, if I recall correctly, in the Desert Fathers at very least, I think this was... It might be Mark the Ascetic. He says that this is itself a type, because you get the inferior graces first when you work for God, and then you get the more beautiful ones as you proceed higher up into the spiritual life. So Leah in Hebrew means cow. Oh, I'm thinking of Rachel. My mistake. Actually, I think this is a mistake in the question myself, because why would Laban be related to Jacob, right? Rebecca married Isaac, I think, actually. You see, I'm not really operating on full cylinders today. Yeah, so anyway, he marries Leah first, because that's the first lesser gift that you get as you pursue God. And then he marries Rebecca, which is what he really wanted, and eventually he gets all of the flocks of Laban through a manipulation of a folk trick, which is God, I suppose, in a certain sense, giving you more than you could ever possibly imagine. Because Jacob, if I remember correctly, he doesn't set out expecting to get tons and tons of stuff off of Laban. I think he sets up purely to get a wife. Yeah, another reason why the Orthodox are kind of a bit, maybe not silly, but like another thing that the Orthodox should remember is that the last schism with Rome was actually enforced by a sultan. That's something that should be remembered more keenly. They don't stay in hell because they want to. They just go to hell because they choose it by their actions. Why wouldn't it be good to implement Old Testament law except, of course, the ritual parts? Well, because Christ obviously fulfilled the ritual parts. And, even the food laws, right? The food laws are very interesting because we don't follow them today because they have been fulfilled by Christ, right? The whole point of staying pure, the whole reason for eating all of these different not eating these different foods is because you wanted to stay pure. Right? There's no obvious basic reason for not eating, say, hyena meat. This is one of the more obscure Levitical food laws, right? And I suspect that many Jews don't actually know why they don't eat hyena meat, and I don't think many people think of that much either, right? But there's an interesting early Christian writing about this called the Epistle of Barnabas. And he says that the reason why hyena meat was not eaten was because that hyenas have genitals that lie, right? So I believe it's the female, under certain circumstances, can display what looks like male genitalia, right? And so they're liars. And so therefore, by eating the meat of a hyena, right, you would be ingesting the food of a liar. And all of these different food laws have this kind of symbolic representation. But of course, God made the hyenas good. So it doesn't actually matter. It's more the symbolism of the whole law. Right, okay, let's see what other things we've got here. This is an interesting one. God visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon their children unto the third and fourth generation, which I think is Exodus 21. Now, this seems to cause a contradiction. In Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 20, only the man who commits the iniquity dies in it, right? Now, obviously this seems to cause a real contradiction on the face of it, but then you think about it. Now, people here who have had alcoholic fathers or grandfathers, or drug addicts in the families, right? In the family, have they been negatively impacted by this? Of course. Right? Are they personally responsible for this? No, of course not. But they are still visited for the iniquity, right? Your father, for example, massive alcoholic, right? Does horrible things at home. It's going to psychologically influence you. And this is, in a certain sense, the visiting of iniquity upon the sons and daughters unto the third and fourth generation, right? Sin has impacts on the family line. And also there's generational spirits, which Father Chad Ripperker talks about, right? Yeah, hyenas are scavengers as well, so I suppose it would be thieves as well. Yeah, but man dying in his iniquity alone, I mean, that's the message of the prophets, and that is very obviously true. Right? This is something quite easy to reconcile. The offering of Lot's daughters So this is when the three angels visit Lot in Sodom before he annihilates it. And the Sodomites try to, break in to have their way with the three angels, who also happen to be a type of the Holy Trinity. And Lot goes, well, you can have my daughters instead, my virgin daughters, right? Now, so far as I understand, if I'm recalling correctly, this is because the levels of protection of guests not only in the Old Testament, but in the Middle East and throughout Eastern cultures generally, is to such a high extent that they would offer their own daughters. They would offer their own daughters before betraying that person. Because if Lot were to betray these three strangers up to the people of Sodom, he would be betraying them. And betrayal is a horrendous sin. Whereas, Lot has complete jurisdiction over his daughters, right? And so it's a lesser evil for that to happen. Now, I also suspect, because there's other interesting things in Genesis chapter 18, like a prefigurement of the Eucharist, right? I also suspect that Lot might think that there is more going on with these three men than immediately strikes the eye. So perhaps he's suspicious and he thinks, okay, maybe I'll get out of this one, right? But yeah, that's the real source of this. It's a level of respect for the person, the host, that is just unprecedented in modern Western culture. In fact, another example of this, I think it's in, what's the name of the movie with Mark Wahlberg as the Navy SEAL? I think it's Lone Survivor. In Lone Survivor, he escapes and he meets this Afghan family, and the Afghan family tries to, feeds Mark Wahlberg. And as he's eating, he notices the children staring at him. And so he gives them his watch. But they keep looking, and eventually they leave. And he goes to sleep, and he hears the mother and father arguing. And it turns out that the seal had eaten the last bit of food that they had. Right? This is the level of hospitality that is in Eastern cultures. So we shouldn't be surprised if they would deprive their own children of food to such an extent in order to protect a guest, right? That they would do the same for what obviously happened to be three angels there to rescue the family. I'm going to go off for 2 seconds. Okay? And I am back. Yeah, for those who are curious about the song, it is the main Semitic theme for Europa Barbarorum 2, as Andre noticed. Okay, so where were we? I'm just going to check the chat to see if there are any interesting questions. What's your opinion on Eastern religions? That their esoteric nature is ridiculous. The fact that they use personal spiritual experience to verify their religious books versus vice versa is a recipe for disaster, and it's exactly why they're always in complete chaos. It's not Pax Judaeorum, it's Rex Judaeorum, but close enough. The difference between Old Testament ethics and New Testament ethics is one of the most fundamental subjects to deal with. Well, you see, they had to change. Because for the prophecies of Isaiah about peace to be fulfilled, there had to be a fundamental change in the covenant to actually implement this. So, for example, in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. Let me find it. Very quickly so I can read it out of here. Okay. He, being Jesus, shall judge between the nations, and shall decide for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Right? In order for this to happen, you had to get rid of all of the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth stuff that is in the... Well, maybe not get rid of, but fulfill the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth stuff in the Old Covenant, right? As Christ says, as you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say that you should love your enemies. Turn the other cheek. If there is to be peace, because obviously there is a much greater level of peace than there was in the Bronze Age now, right? The judge, who is judging between nations and the many peoples, right? Not all peoples. Jews will say that this is for all peoples. He says many. So, of course, not everyone is going to go to the New Covenant. For this to occur, there must be a certain supersession of the law, which is made manifest, because obviously to take revenge is superseded by taking the insult in a charitable and just way. Right? It also needs people to, of course, as a result of adopting this new law, to beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, right? You don't go and fight and then expect peace. Yet the old law is full of specifically national laws for conscription. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Christians don't necessarily do that now. Of course, you have things like the Crusades, but in the church of itself, it is a place of peace. And then finally, nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn more anymore. Now, this is understood to be the fruit of, living a life of peace, right? I can't remember if... I know that St. Thomas Aquinas says that this can be seen manifest in the real world through, the peace in Christian communities in spite of the constant persecutions. But a friend of mine, in fact Hassan, who's been on here a bunch of times, says that he believes that this reflects heaven. Right? So, in order for this to actually be fulfilled, there must be some sort of change to the old law. Not a complete, abolishment. Of course, it's not a complete abolishment. In fact, Christ is incredibly clear on this in the Gospel of Matthew. He simply holds people to a higher standard. And for those who say, oh, Christianity isn't a religion of peace, right? Go and read the lives of the saints. They are the most peaceful people in existence, and they are also the people who took Christ the most seriously. So this is one of the explanations for the difference in Old Testament ethics. Because you cannot have the sort of peace that Isaiah is describing without the fulfillment of the Old Testament covenant, which is essentially just the removal of the ritual laws that are fulfilled in Christ, and Christ holding us to a higher standard in our moral lives. Because, like it or not, we are held to a much higher moral standard in the new law than we are in the old. But thankfully, we have the sacraments to help us with this. In fact, I seem to recall... Actually, you know what, never mind. I'll save that for the Jewish polemic stream, I think. Okay. All the Egyptians' firstborns being killed, right? I've already addressed this with the waters of Babylon, right? The Egyptians, that being, the sinful big bad empire, tried to wipe out the children of Israel, right? Which are the virtues. And so, likewise, God responds and wipes out the firstborn of Egypt, which are the vices. Although, of course, it obviously happened in a physical way. Okay, so we're actually out of the questions that I had written down because I already answered the hell one. Should Christians not engage in war, even if it comes to their door? Well, if we were to follow the Sabbath, as is said by the Old Testament, then obviously we should fight. Because the Maccabees did, David did. Jesus points this out to the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees are following around Jesus and trying to catch him in some sort of legal loophole. And Jesus knows this and goes, well, actually, no, you. And points out that David and the Maccabees worked on the Sabbath for the necessity of keeping life. I think this was actually in the healing of the man's hand in the temple, right? So yeah, of course we should. We should, of course, defend ourselves because we are there to protect life. The Sabbath exists to, preserve life. You rest on the Sabbath because if you work 7 days a week, you'd be exhausted and miserable. The Sabbath exists for man. And it's also obviously there to give thanks to God. But, if you have to, withhold that law for the sake of preserving your own life and your own ability to fulfill the highest commandment, which is to love God with all of your body and all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your mind, right? You do it. Let's change to just a question and answer session. Because I think that we've still got some time. I want to spend some time answering questions. Why do you think that the Desert Fathers almost tortured themselves? Well, I think that they basically did. So you've got Abba Bessarion and people like that spending 14 days in bushes of thorns, right? They kind of did. And that was to enforce their virtue. They wanted to be heroically virtuous, as Christ commands us. Be perfect. Be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so they went to extremes. And obviously, people like Abba Bessarion couldn't sustain, standing in a thorn bush for 14 days to fight off sleep purely on their own. They had to have grace, because this is impossible, right? It's the same with Saint Jean Vianney, a guy who lived off of potatoes for decades, right? Like a single potato a day, right? It's the same principle there. Same with Saint Catherine of Siena and with Blessed Alexandrina de Acosta, right? They lived off the Eucharist for decades. What's her face? I've forgotten her first name. German woman, Neumann, did the same thing for decades, right? Suffering is there for the improvement of our virtues, right? It's not like God permits physical evil for no reason, right? It's because we need it in order to develop in virtue. You don't develop in virtue unless you're put to the test. That's always been my attitude as well. I mean, the whole thing is the cross. Like, how could God redeem the whole world? How could God fulfill the Day of Atonement if he hadn't sent his own son down there as an infinitely pleasing sacrifice to suffer, die, be buried, and rise again on the third day? Right? How could he make atonement? In fact, that's another thing that the Jews deny. They deny that they need atonement, yet their own law has it. Strange. There's a lot of very... Jewish apologetics on the internet is really not that good. They'll claim that the Levitical laws of animal sacrifices were only related to accidental things, and then the next chapter will provide a bunch of examples where there must be animal sacrifice for the sake of things that are deliberate, right? And of course, the Day of Atonement is another one of these things, right? You need to suffer to die and be buried in the old man, and then resurrect on the third day in accordance, in order to become the new man. Okay. Let's see. Et campos ubi Troia fuit asks, any tips on trying to convert a Buddhist? They seem to not understand Logos and have a terrible interpretation of kenosis, emptying of Christ. Want to convert a Buddhist friend here? Well, I think you're going to need to clarify this a bit more to me, because I don't know if this is a serious Buddhist or if this is sort of a Western one. Andy says, Irishman here, living off a single potato a day is no miracle. It's a lack of spuds that kills you. Why do you consider Aquinas to have been the most intelligent person in history and rank above Aristotle? Well, I don't. I think Jesus was. But why do I think he ranks above Aristotle? Because he infinitely exceeds him. His philosophy is just far more sublime. It's more detailed, and it has a greater sense of what's going on. Now, you could say that Aristotle just kind of lived in mud huts, right? He had access to, Plato and a bunch of pre-Socratics. But that still doesn't change the fact that Aquinas did a lot more. Oh, she is Western. I think this might actually be a good example. Because Alexandra asks, any suggestions on how to quit the New Age movement? I find myself interested in it around a year ago due to getting a recommendation on YouTube, but now I can see how deceiving this movement is. Well, I think that you could go the very blunt way and you could realise that it's demons behind this movement. You could realise that everyone who gets involved in it gets chewed up in some way. I think we can see this. Like I've known women who they don't end up very well out of doing their New Age practices, right? And thirdly, you could realise that it's contrary to the truth. But really, I know that you're looking for a certain richness and a certain hole to fill, because otherwise you wouldn't be looking into the New Age movement. And that answer is Catholic spirituality. You need to look, if you are interested in something that is authentically spiritual, and as I'm assuming you're a girl, something that's kind of girly as well, I would recommend reading Saint Therese of Lisieux's Story of a Soul, because that's intensely girly. It's very endearing also. And it will give you a start on how to, understand meditation, Christian meditation, how to, follow the law of Christ, and also wraps it up in a package that also shows you how to deal with immense suffering, because Therese of Lisieux suffered so badly that she doubted the existence of heaven at points. She doubted the existence of God because she was suffering so badly. And we all reach that kind of point at some point, right? You sometimes just suffer so aggressively and so horribly that you're wondering why. Right? And you're not alone. Well, I knew this girl very well, who's been very, very deeply hurt by friends of hers and just by horrible acts of providence, right? And she couldn't understand it, and she just wanted the pain to stop, so she started getting involved in the New Age movement. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it's not had the best effect. But this could be solved by the more satisfying, not only intellectually, but also the more satisfying spiritually, the Catholic mystics. And so there needs to be an emphasis on this. Another book, The Fulfillment of All Desire, whose author I can't remember. That's a good one. These things should be read, and they are just going to satisfy you a lot more than any sort of New Agey stuff. The Old Testament law question was more about the criminal punishment, as you gave the impression it would be obsolete as well. But it seems to be the only criminal code given by God and looks like a good cure for modern degeneracy. Or to modern degeneracy. Well, in current Roman Catholic discipline, we aren't to enforce the death penalty, right? And this is fine. This is completely legitimate because it's a change in discipline, not a change in doctrine. It isn't changing the inherent nature of grave sins that they don't deserve death. It just means that we don't kill people because it's not practical. First of all, it's contrary to charity, and we also have the ability to lock them up, right? So in ancient times, they didn't have the capacity to lock up serious criminals for life. But I also don't think that the death penalty would be a good solution to modern degeneracy either. Because you just frighten the majority of people. They would eventually begin to resent it. They would begin to hate, and then they would overthrow you. And then they would, do it even worse than they were before. So I think that the best way to approach this is with compassion. You have to remember that Christ, Christ with the Pharisees and the sinful woman who was caught in adultery. The Pharisees, of course, knew that the punishment for adultery was death, and they were saying, who should stone this woman? And Christ goes, let him who hath no sin cast the first stone. He doesn't ignore the law. He knows, of course, that the punishment for adultery is death. But what he is saying is that, should we not have another jury? And what better jury, what better three witnesses than the Holy Trinity? Is it not ultimately down to God to punish the sinner and not us? And it's the same thing, right? We will see God reward people who violate those particular laws in our own lifetimes, right? We don't need to place Old Testament laws over them. They fulfill themselves because God enforces them. Do you think MGTOW is the best lifestyle for atheists, or do you think that there is a better way for atheists to live? I think that MGTOW as a community is something that should be avoided, but I do think that celibacy outside of marriage is the preferable route. I think that the MGTOW movement and I say this in retrospect, the PUA movement and all those sorts of manosphere, I suppose you'd call them, movements should really be avoided, because a lot of it is just resentful men venting their problems on the internet. And that's not to say that they don't have legitimate grievances, of course they do. But there's no sense spending lots of time in those communities, because you'll just gain more resentment as a result. And you don't need that in your life. You've got one life. You will die. You will have to face Christ. And if you have been made bitter because you have chosen to spend your time with people who are bitter, regardless of the legitimacy of their particular complaints, how can you, how are you going to explain that? When God says, the days, the day's worries are sufficient for itself. Don't worry about not having a girlfriend, for example. I've never had a girlfriend. Don't worry about, don't worry about children because you see the quality of the women. God will provide, right? You see that people seem to forget that this has been, maybe not to the same extent, but it's been a similar case in most of history. In fact, in the Old Testament times, it was very much the case. I mean, you had people openly burning their babies to Molech and all sorts of licentiousness. You had, temple prostitution, which is not far off of what we have now in nightclubs, right? And you know what the patriarchs of the Old Testament did? They waited, and God rewarded them. So why would you be any different? Our forefathers have succeeded. All they did was follow God's commands, and they listened to him. And the same with Christians, right? Not just the old Israelites, the Christians afterwards, because we are the new covenant, right? You see providence working through St. Paul, right? You see it working through the apostles. You see it in the lives of the saints. Are you any different? Of course not. So don't worry about don't get involved in these resentful movements and let the resentment solve themselves, because God knows them better than you do. I mean, Christ himself has witnessed every sin on Mount, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and sweat blood, right? You think he doesn't know? Don't worry. And I understand that that's a very hard thing to request, and it's something that I struggle with myself. But it really is the only way. Okay, let's continue. Have you heard of the Academia Vivarium Novum? Is that the one that teaches Latin spoken? Yeah, I have. Who's your favourite Neoplatonic philosopher? Probably St. Augustine of Hippo. St. Teresa of Avila is a little bit complicated. That's why I didn't recommend it. Have you read books on the Venerable Fulton Sheen? Read his books. They're really good. Oh, Story of a Soul is edited. The autobiography of a saint is translated by Monsignor Knox, I think, as the original manuscripts. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's for the St. Teresa of Lisieux book. Would it mean that Catholicism isn't true if we said that the death penalty is inherently wrong? Well, we're not saying that it's inherently wrong. We're saying it's not the current discipline. Disciplines have changed. It's like, with the liturgy. The liturgy has changed repeatedly. There are disciplines in law which change, but the doctrine never changes, right? I mean, even the Old Testament people knew this, right? When they modified the laws surrounding the Sabbath, they understood the reason for the Sabbath, and then they changed the laws surrounding it in order to preserve the original purpose. That's what it's meant by the spirit of the law. So, let's see. Are there any more questions from you guys? Any final questions? Oh, wait. I completely missed that. Sorry. Fuss asks, what is the Church's official version of a symbiosis with the modern Earth creation theory? Could you clarify what you mean by that? Because, if you're referring to, like, young Earth creationism versus evolution, this has been going on since year dot, right? Like, you had people who didn't believe in literal 7-day creation. In the inception of the church. Philo of Alexandria didn't believe in it. Not Saint Origen, that was a slip. Origen of Alexandria and Saint Augustine didn't believe in a literal 7-day creation. If I remember correctly, Origen and Saint Augustine believed the world was created in an instant. However, you have other people like Saint Basil the Great who did believe in a literal historical 7-day creation. So, you see, I don't know what you're actually asking here, but, there doesn't need to be any synthesis with modern evolutionary theories or old Earth, because this has always been a debate. There's never been like a set idea of how long the world has existed. Like, there have been Anno Mundi dates that are adopted by some people, right? But even these are, very much in, they aren't set in stone, because the genealogies in Genesis, if interpreted through the cultures around it, might not represent literal ages. I suspect that they might. But they could also represent the significance of particular dynasties. They could reflect the significance of particular persons. They don't even have to refer to people. They could just be dynasties, right? You see, you're talking about genealogies that are so old that we don't have complete evidence of them. You're talking about things that are 3,500 years old. it's very hard to interpret those things, in a very literalistic 21st century way, and have it make sense. There's all sorts of different debates. There have been millions of gods throughout human history. How do you know which one to believe in? Well, it's very simple, Raymond. Which one is being itself? Which one is ego e me? Because there are, of course, other gods, right? Like Zeus may exist in some sense. The Baalim clearly existed. You have, the various Hindu gods. But there's no sense in worshipping these things. They're little g gods. But the big G god is pure being. He is ego e me. As is called in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, I am that I am. Pure act. Pure being. And it is the highest thing in existence. This is what I worship, which is the Trinity. And it is the highest thing in being, because it is being. Well, actually, no, there aren't gods that predate the Christian God, so you'd be wrong. Just because the documents themselves are older doesn't mean that the God itself doesn't predate those gods. Something off topic, but is mindfulness meditation wrong and sinful? I don't know what mindfulness meditation is. Hinduism doesn't predate this Christianity. In fact, Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita was finalized around the 2nd century AD, so that's actually false. Responding to Raymond Phillips here. I don't like the sound of the mindfulness part. Have you tried Lectio Divina? It may be worth having a look into that. That might help with your anxiety problems, because I know for a fact that when I mentally pray, that it will calm me down a lot more. Right, I've been going through a stint where I haven't been mentally praying as much as I was, because I was mentally praying 2-3 times a day for quite a while, and I've lost that, and I've lost my sense of peace. Right? So it might be beneficial to look into, say, the ways of mental prayer by Lahodier. I'll type in the book in the chat for you. Yeah, I know you're not trolling. I'm giving you a serious answer. Was the Garden of Eden a place in heaven? No. No, it wasn't. By God's very nature, he predates Hinduism. Since the death penalty is not the current discipline, does this mean that countries cannot execute traitors? Well, not in line with social teaching, not in line with Catholic teaching, no. Yeah, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is a very interesting podcast. Oh, it's Vedic. Yeah, run 1,000 miles from that. Yeah, run 1,000 miles from that. It's called Lectio Divina. Because if you're doing things like centering prayer or transcendental meditation, well, I mean, you only have to look at what happened to the Beatles after they started doing that to know that it's a bad sign. Right. Oh, I see. So Thomas has mentioned the existence of Adam and Eve. Yeah, I believe they legitimately existed as the first humans, because it just inherently makes sense, as well as corresponding to the scientific evidence as well. Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve. There are problems with population, though, but that's more for biological anthropologists to solve. I happen to think that they were preserved from the kinds of problems that you have with very low populations, probably through miracles, because human beings are utterly unique when it comes to all other creatures. Indian style woo-woo prayer is not mentioned in the Rig Veda, nor like anything related to the Vedas run 1,000 miles from it. or anything in the Mahabharata as well. That's just run. What happened to the Beatles? They went a bit doolally and they split up, basically. Like, whatever you do, don't look into John Lennon's solo work. Let's see. Are people like Ed Fazer who dissent on the death penalty in bad standing? I'm not sure he does, because this recently changed. How much of the Gnostic scriptures have you read? I remember once I listened through the Gospel of Truth and I thought it was hilarious. Actually, I didn't think it was hilarious. I thought it was just boring. There was the Gospel of Judas, which I had to look over. That was weird. What else? Infancy Gospel of Thomas is gross. Beyond that, I'm not sure. Assuming Jesus didn't exist in the flesh, would you still be Catholic? Well, no. Because, first of all, Jesus did exist in the flesh. That much is obvious, even if you talk to atheists. And second of all, it's Catholic doctrine. Well, it helped me with a lot of problems. Don't do it anymore. It never got. Yeah, you see, you can. Yeah, it could cause serious problems. You're very lucky, Alphonse. I'll say that. Just if you're going to practice meditation, don't practice it from the Vedas. Have I read Enoch? Parts of it. I thought it was a bit weird, but it was obviously influential enough that St. Jude would cite it in his epistle. Why is the death penalty not the discipline for today? Because Rome said so. That's all that really needs to be said. They have their reasons. You can go. I'm sure you can go read what they've written on it. I had to read the Gnostic Gospels from my college class and felt dirty the whole way through. Yeah, they're very strange. They're like LARP. They're like LARP Christianity. I seem to remember the Gospel of Thomas begins, something like, I'm the Apostle Thomas of Jesus, the philosopher. And it's like, well, he was Jewish, so why would he be called a philosopher? A clearer question in the same vein again, advocating from a different person's position. Who I know. Can it be said what God is cruel for creating Earth and the universe? No. Because in order for something to be bad, it has to lack something. This is why we call it a disability. So, evil things in themselves don't, like, the evil part of it anyway, doesn't exist. There's an absence. There's always some sort of absence, Like, if you're torturing a puppy to death, there's an absence of compassion for the puppy. If you are, if you like, suffer a cancer, right, your immune system isn't operating properly, and so it's generating cells that lead to, a cancer, or immune system, or whatever, right? Like, the body is misbehaving. It's not acting as it should. There's a privation there. So if God were evil, if God were bad, if God were, like, horrible, then nothing would exist. Because the thing that all evil things share in common, which is privation of things, is literally a non-being. So it is impossible for God to be evil. What are you reading at the moment? I have been reading the Old Testament and New Testament from the RSV translation. Yesterday I was writing some briefing notes, so I've been reading through various European legal texts. A Catholic Introduction to the Old Testament by John Bergsma and Brant Petrie, which I actually didn't need to use for this chat. Cancer is a privation of cellular death, well, except when it develops into a tumour. Tumours are productions of what's it? That's it. It's a change in the Hayflick limit in the cells, right? So the Hayflick limit leads to cellular reproduction without any kind of control, which leads to tumours. Right, what else have I been reading? I have also got... Actually, I haven't been reading that. I've got this book here today, Italian grammar drills. I was going to start learning Italian to help me learn Latin, but then I changed my mind. What do you think could be the cause of why so many classicists have swung to the left? Because the universities are on the left. Yeah, Hira answered my question for me. Yeah, actually, one of the strange things about the Old Testament is that a lot of it has the Jews coping, right? So, for example, if you look at Jeremiah, chapter 33, verse 16, I think it is. It is 17. Thus says the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel. And the Levitical priests themselves, not necessarily the laws, shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to burn cereal offerings, and to make sacrifices forever. Okay. Now, we haven't had a Levitical priest ordained in 1,950 years. The Second Temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Therefore, this couldn't be a Levitical priest in the sense that the Jews hold him to be. Now, the famous Jewish commentator Rashi actually has to change the meaning of this verse in order to answer it. He says that really he's referring to the seed of Aaron, and that this somehow the seed offers cereal offerings. That you see, it doesn't work. Rashi doesn't actually answer this question. Actually, let me Google Rashi's commentary on this first, so I can actually read it out properly. Let's see. Also, I've checked the Jeremiah Tanakh as well, and it's the same thing. Where is his commentary show? Yeah, he's referring to seed. He says that for all time means seed. There shall not be cut off from the seed fit to offer up a burnt offering or to burn a meal offering, right? Now, this is obviously not what this is saying. This is what it says in the Hebrew. And of the Levitic priests there shall not be cut off from me before me a man offering up a burnt offering or burning a meal offering or performing a sacrifice for all time. So obviously Rashi is contradicting it. Right? Because you need to be ordained in the old priesthood to be able to offer up a burnt offering. So they haven't had this for 2,000 years. We, however, do. For Christ converted many of the Levitical priests. In fact, this is said in Acts chapter 6, verse 7, that many of the Levitical priests joined the faith. Rashi is a Jewish commentator. So, since God makes a promise that there will always be a man to offer up cereal offerings for God, and the Jews haven't been able to do this for 2,000 years, doesn't that make them void? Yeah, I tried Lingua Latina Persi Illustrata, but I haven't been able to sit down for long enough and actually read it. I sort of burn out on other things at the same time. What is your opinion on the Book of Judith? Why are the supposed errors which critics attach to it? Well, you see, I happen to think that the Book of Judith is fiction, because it makes it very clear in the first chapter, by its mingling of words, that it's referring to some sort of strange mix of, well, I mean, most of them are Antichrist, so I don't think the particular reference to the Persians as Antichrist is relevant. But it mixes together all of these different nations that Israel has had to face in some way or another. Actually, they didn't, so never mind. I was going to say that in Esther they almost wipe out the Jews entirely. But this obviously doesn't come to pass. I happen to think that it's all a type of the Virgin Mary crushing the head of the snake, because that's what Judith does, cut off the head of Holofernes. And the mingling of the names is an indication of this. I think that it doesn't need to be historical to be in the Old Testament and to be divinely inspired and be inerrant, because the Song of Songs is, and that's not historical. What did Rashi have to say about Christ Isidore? Because, okay, so let's repeat this to ourselves again, because I can't actually see how Rashi gets this out of the state. So, and of the Levitic priests, and this is from their own translation, by the way, there shall not be cut off from before me a man offering up a burnt offering, or burning a meal offering, or performing a sacrifice for all time. So yeah, it's clearly referring to a man of the Levitic priests who will offer up sacrifice for all time. Now Rashi says, there shall not be cut off from them seed fit to offer up a burnt offering, or to burn a meal offering. This is contrary to what his own scriptures are saying. So if you're a priest in the Levite rite, you wouldn't lose it. But since there weren't priests in the rite of Melchizedek, they couldn't perform the liturgy of the presbyter. Well, you see, the Levitical priesthood is a part of the Melchizedekian priesthood in the grand scheme. Because Jethro is a priest of the Most High God, so is Melchizedek, who's in Genesis, and the Levites just happen to serve the same God, just under a different covenant. So, it's not inconceivable that there could be a new order of priests. And we know, as I've said from the book of Acts, that Levitical priesthoods, the Levitical priesthood, a lot of them did actually convert to Christianity. It's often underestimated how much of an influence Christianity had in the first century. Otherwise, as we see in the histories of Suetonius, right, the Jews are driven out of Rome on account of a man called Cresto, which is conceivably Christ, under the reign of Claudius. This is even mentioned in Acts as well. Likewise, Tacitus mentions the genocide, well, not the genocide, the persecution of Christians under Nero, only 30 years after Christ's crucifixion. You also have the letter of Pliny. Is it Pliny or Livy? I think it's Livy the Younger. To, I suspect it's either Trajan or Hadrian. Either way, in the 110s AD, asking how to deal with the Christians. And, surprisingly, the emperor is actually quite lenient with them. It seems to only have been the psychopath emperors, with the exception of Diocletian, who actually went after the Christians. Oh yeah, the Pantera one. That's a big meme. That's been a meme since the 2nd century. Because Origin of Alexandria pointed that out. And, if that were true, then don't you think that Jesus might have been a little bit more disturbed? Don't you think that the Christian people, as, sons of Christ, might be more disturbed if he were conceived in such disgusting circumstances? And don't you think maybe the local community might have known that? And so shunned Jesus, very openly? The rabbis and the Pharisees were renowned for staying away from public sinners because it was seen as the good thing to do, and yet they keep company with Christ in their very synagogue. Don't you think that's rather strange for somebody who was conceived in such a supposedly horrible manner? Or is it perhaps that they are blaspheming? I think it's probably the latter, especially since this supposed whatever, I'm not going to utter it. Our most blessed mother continually appears to us and provides us prudent advice. Right? Don't you think that's rather strange, considering what the Jews say about it? Especially when they can't even read their own scriptures. I don't know what Rashi is reading, but it's certainly not what is being said in the English. Oh, I mean, actually, this is for another stream, because there's a lot of different things. Like, if you look at the Jewish translation of Isaiah chapter 9, and then compare it to all of the Christian ones, and you know enough Hebrew, and you can see in the Hebrew itself the commas, you will realise that they are not translating the names by which the Messiah will be named, because there's a very troublesome one, and that is Mighty God. Now, it says Mighty God. Now, wouldn't that contradict the oneness of God in the sense that he has one person? Because how can God in the flesh, who is with us, who is called Mighty God, have fear of the Lord if it's himself? I mean, obviously the Father and I are one, right? They are one in mind, but they are separate persons, right? How could Jesus have the gift of the fear of the Lord if there's only one person in Christ, one person in God, right? Their own scriptures contradict them. Like, the Lord has said to my Lord, "Thou art my son; this day have I begotten thee." Right? You know, the co-regency in Psalm 110. You know, the Lord hath said to my Lord, "Sit on my right." You know, it's been bugging me for days because I've been reading all of this constantly, and the Jewish polemics against Christianity online are just pathetic. They rely on Bart Ehrman and things like that. It's like, oh, the Gospels were just a game of telephone. All right, then why isn't the Torah? Like, I'm not going to suggest that the Torah was just a game of telephone, but it's certainly going to really warp the Jewish scriptures a lot harder than the New Testament ones. Hello. Let's see. I'm just saying hello to C.I. Napoli there in the chat. Do you think that we can learn from some Eastern religions like Sikhism or Buddhism, considering the intra-religious dialogue with Buddhism in particular has been productive since Vatican II? I have no idea what you mean by learn. I remember seeing on Catholic Answers that hell was created by demons, but I'm pretty sure demons can't create anything. Did God create hell, or is hell just that which is not of God? Well, you see, hell exists, so in some sense it must be sustained by God. I don't know if you could say that the demons created it, since they don't really create anything. But I don't know the full context. I might well be wrong as well. Okay, so we've been going for nearly 2 hours. I'm going to bring this stream to a close. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.